The lights above the convention hall burned white and merciless, the kind of light built for cameras rather than for human eyes. And beneath them stood a machine that had cost $80 million to design, refine, and finally unveil to the world. Thousands of guests filled the seats that evening, investors in tailored suits, journalists from more than a dozen countries, engineers who had spent 3 years of their lives shaping a single vehicle, and above them all, screens carried the moment to audiences far beyond the walls of the building. At the center of the stage stood Victoria Sterling, 37 years old, chief executive of Sterling Hyperdynamics, a woman whose composure had become nearly as famous as her company's engineering achievements. She wore confidence the way other people wore perfume, subtle but impossible to ignore once you noticed it. And tonight, she intended to prove, once and for all, that her company had built the future of the automobile industry. The car behind her, veiled beneath a sheet of black fabric, was called Project Phoenix. The first hypercar in existence, powered by a quantum-assisted drivetrain, a machine she had personally overseen from its earliest blueprint to the final polished steel. She had told her board that this single night would define the next decade of the entire industry. And standing there under those blinding lights, she believed it completely, because she had given the project every hour of her waking life for 3 long years and had nothing left to give it beyond this final unveiling. Not far from the entrance, a man in a worn work jacket carried a battered toolbox toward a service garage 2 blocks away, entirely indifferent to the spectacle unfolding behind him. His name was Ethan Hayes, 39 years old, a widower who lived a quiet life fixing engines that other mechanics had long since given up on. Few people who watched him pass, oil staining the creases of his knuckles, would have guessed that he had once held more than 120 patents in materials engineering and thermal design, that he had been personally invited to collaborate with a national space research program, or that he had co-founded a battery technology company years before selling his shares to care for his family, after a loss that still shaped every quiet hour of his private life. He preferred anonymity to applause. He preferred the honest smell of grease and the certainty of a bolt turning true beneath his own hands to the noise of any stage. And most evenings after work he simply went home to an empty house, made a simple dinner, and read old engineering journals until the words blurred together. And sleep finally arrived. As he passed near the staging area that evening, he noticed, almost by accident, a technician installing a voltage sensor cluster in the wrong sequence, a mistake so small that most observers would never catch it, and significant enough to shut an entire electrical system down without a single warning. Outside the hall, banners bearing the Sterling Hyperdynamics crest stretched 3 stories high, and rows of luxury vehicles from every era of the company's history lined the entrance for arriving guests to admire on their way inside. Valets in matching uniforms directed a steady stream of black cars toward the red carpet, while photographers jostled for position along a velvet rope, hoping to capture the exact moment the world's most anticipated hypercar was finally revealed to the public. Inside, waiters carried trays of champagne between round tables reserved for the wealthiest names in finance and technology, and a live orchestra played softly beneath the murmur of 1,000 private conversations about market projections and battery chemistry. None of it concerned Ethan Hayes as he walked past the loading dock that evening, his mind already on the worn transmission housing waiting for him back at the garage, a problem that felt far more honest to him than anything happening beneath those bright stage lights. He had learned, in the years since his wife's passing, that peace rarely arrived through recognition, and that a life spent quietly solving small, solvable problems suited him far better than one spent chasing headlines he no longer wanted or needed. He mentioned it quietly, out of simple courtesy, wanting no credit and expecting no thanks, only hoping to prevent a problem before it could grow into something larger and more embarrassing for everyone involved. The technician waved him off without turning around, certain that a man dressed like a mechanic could have nothing useful to contribute about a vehicle worth tens of millions of dollars, and muttered something about amateurs wandering where they did not belong. Victoria, standing several feet away, reviewing her closing remarks on a small tablet, overheard the brief exchange and turned with the practiced coolness of someone long accustomed to command. She studied Ethan for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to register his clothing, his calloused hands, the scuffed toolbox resting at his side, and none of the details that actually mattered about the man standing in front of her. "Leave engineering to real engineers," she said, her voice carrying just far enough for the small crowd nearby to hear every word clearly. Someone laughed under their breath at the remark. And another voice, lighter and careless, added that he was just a mechanic, nothing more than that, and certainly nothing worth taking seriously on a night this important. Ethan did not argue, and he did not defend himself, because defending himself had never once solved anything in his experience. He offered only a small, unreadable smile, lifted his toolbox from the floor, and walked away, leaving behind a woman who believed, in that instant, that the matter was already closed for good. The countdown began soon afterward. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, each number rolling across the massive screens above the stage, while camera operators leaned closer, and nervous investors held their collective breath in perfect unison. Victoria pressed the ignition sequence herself, her hand perfectly steady, her expression carrying the practiced calm of a woman who had rehearsed this exact motion 100 times behind closed doors in front of an empty room. For a brief moment, the interior display flickered gently to life, soft blue light spreading warmly across the dashboard, and the crowd rose almost as one in anticipation of what was coming next. Then everything died completely, and without warning. There was no gradual failure, no flickering hesitation, only silence, total and absolute, as though the machine had simply chosen, in that instant, to stop existing entirely in front of everyone watching. The screens above the stage froze mid-broadcast, capturing Victoria's stunned expression for the whole world to study. Frame by frame, in the hours that followed, in another city entirely, a trading floor reacted within minutes of the broadcast freezing, and Sterling Hyperdynamics watched its stock value slide during the very presentation meant to send it soaring toward new and unprecedented heights. For 3 full years, Victoria had personally signed off on every major decision behind Project Phoenix, from the sourcing of rare materials for the drivetrain to the final selection of the paint finish gleaming under the stage lights that night. She had missed birthdays, canceled vacations, and turned down 2 serious relationships because neither man had understood why a car mattered more to her than dinner reservations. Her board had warned her, more than once, that resting the company's entire future on a single unproven technology carried enormous risk, and she had answered every warning the same way, by working later, sleeping less, and trusting the engineers she had personally recruited from the finest universities in the country. Standing there in the silence, following the failed ignition, she felt 3 years of sacrifice collapse in the space of a single frozen screen. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not know what to do next. Engineers rushed toward the vehicle at once. An entire small army of specialists who had personally built every circuit inside it. And still, after 30 full minutes of frantic diagnostics, not one among them could identify precisely what had gone wrong with the machine they knew better than anyone alive. Laptops connected to hidden diagnostic ports returned nothing but blank, meaningless readings, screen after screen of empty static where detailed reports should have appeared. Cables were checked, then rechecked, then replaced entirely, all without a single flicker of success or explanation. Victoria stood just off to the side of the stage, arms folded tightly, jaw set, watching her life's work sit lifeless in front of the entire industry she had spent years trying to impress and win over completely. Board members called her privately within minutes of the failure, their voices sharp with concern rather than the encouragement she desperately needed to hear in that moment. Reporters in the audience began quietly drafting headlines about failure before the hall had even fully emptied of its stunned and murmuring guests. She had built her entire reputation on precision, and precision, for the very first time in her career, had abandoned her completely and publicly in front of millions. Ethan had not yet left the building when the disaster unfolded on stage behind him. He stood near the rear service entrance, where deliveries were usually made, watching the growing chaos from a distance that most people passing by would have mistaken for simple indifference toward the whole affair. It took him only a few minutes of quiet observation to understand what the specialists, brilliant as they clearly were, had somehow missed entirely in their panic. The problem was not the battery architecture, and it was not a corrupted line of software. And it certainly was not some catastrophic flaw buried deep inside the vehicle's advanced control unit as everyone assumed. The issue was smaller and stranger than any of them had considered in their rush to find something dramatic. A synchronization fault in the timing sequence of the very voltage sensor cluster he had noticed installed incorrectly less than an hour earlier. A fault that minor could easily trigger a full protective lockdown across the entire electrical system, freezing the car in place as a built-in safety measure rather than risking any kind of fire or malfunction. An issue invisible to anyone searching for something dramatic, instead of something small, quiet, and easily overlooked by even the most experienced eyes. He approached security and asked, politely and without any urgency in his voice, if he might speak with someone about the vehicle sitting dead on the stage in front of everyone. He was turned away without a moment's hesitation, the guard barely glancing at him before waving him firmly back toward the exit doors. Victoria, passing nearby with her phone pressed tightly against her ear, caught sight of him again and could not resist offering one final dismissal. "Mechanics don't diagnose quantum systems," she said. The words meant more to reassure her own fraying nerves than to genuinely insult the man standing quietly before her. Ethan turned to leave once more, prepared to let the moment pass the way he let most moments pass, without protest, without any need to prove himself right in front of strangers who had already made up their minds about him. But one member of the board, a quiet older man named Richard Alden, who had spent decades working in the automotive industry, and had learned long ago that real expertise rarely announced itself with volume or confidence, had watched the entire exchange unfold from a distance. He hurried after Ethan before he could reach the parking area, asking him directly, almost desperately, whether he actually knew what might be wrong with the car sitting lifeless behind them. Victoria agreed to let him inside only because Richard insisted so firmly, and only because absolutely nothing else had worked in the past 30 minutes. And only because the broadcast lights were still glowing above a car that stubbornly refused to breathe or make a single sound. She stood at the edge of the stage with her arms crossed tightly, bracing herself internally to be disappointed one final time that evening in front of everyone she had invited. Ethan asked for a single condition before he would begin working: that no one interrupt him while he worked through the problem at his own careful pace. And though the request unsettled the anxious engineers still hovering nervously nearby, Victoria nodded because she had simply run out of alternatives worth considering. He opened the technical access panel beneath the rear compartment with the calm efficiency of a man who had performed this exact kind of work 1,000 times before, though admittedly never on a vehicle worth this much money in front of this many watching cameras and reporters. He replaced nothing at all inside the compartment. He did not call for spare parts, and he did not request any additional tools beyond what he already carried in his worn leather bag slung over one shoulder. He simply repositioned 2 connector terminals that had been installed in reverse order, reset the protective cycle that had locked the entire system down automatically, and recalibrated the sensor cluster by hand, working with the quiet, unhurried patience of a man solving a puzzle rather than performing for an audience of thousands. 10 minutes passed in near total silence, broken only occasionally by the soft click of a wrench or the faint hum of a diagnostic tablet resting beside him on the floor. Then Ethan straightened slowly, wiped his hands clean on a cloth pulled from his pocket, and said only 2 quiet words: "Try now." Victoria hesitated for a long moment, glancing helplessly toward her lead engineers, who offered nothing in return but stunned, uncertain silence and a few uneasy shrugs. She pressed the ignition sequence a second time, bracing herself internally for yet another failure in front of the entire watching world and every camera in the building. Instead, the hypercar came suddenly alive, the electric drivetrain surging with a controlled, powerful hum that filled the hall through its carefully engineered sound system, a deep and resonant note, designed to evoke the emotional power of a traditional combustion engine without sacrificing any of the efficiency that electric propulsion promised its drivers. The audience rose from their seats all at once, applause breaking across the room like a wave crashing against the stage, and the broadcast feed that had frozen in quiet humiliation only minutes earlier now carried instead the sound of an entire hall erupting in genuine, Unrehearsed celebration. Victoria stood frozen for a moment, watching the man in the oil-stained jacket step quietly back from the vehicle without waiting for thanks or recognition, and something inside her chest tightened in a way she could not immediately explain to herself. Backstage, in the confusion that followed, a young publicist tried desperately to control the narrative, feeding carefully worded statements to reporters about a routine calibration delay, though everyone in that room understood the truth was far less flattering than any press release could disguise. Nearby, a small group of investors quietly discussed pulling their commitments before the ink on their contracts had even dried, murmuring among themselves about the wisdom of trusting a company that could not start its own flagship product in front of the entire world. Richard Alden watched all of it unfold with the tired patience of a man who had survived several corporate crises before this one. And it was Richard, more than anyone else that night, who understood that the solution to this problem would not come from another expensive consultant or another emergency phone call to headquarters. It would come, if it came at all, from someone willing to actually look at the machine itself rather than at the spreadsheets, explaining why it should have worked in theory. In the days that followed, Victoria could not stop thinking about the man who had solved, in 10 unhurried minutes, what her most decorated engineers had failed to solve in half an hour of frantic, expensive effort. Curiosity, and perhaps a flicker of guilt she refused to name aloud even to herself, led her to quietly research his background late one evening, sitting alone at her desk long after her staff had gone home for the night. What she discovered unsettled the very confidence she had carried into that disastrous presentation only days earlier. Ethan Hayes had once held more than 120 patents across materials, science, and thermal engineering, technologies still quietly powering much of the electric vehicle industry today, without most people ever knowing his name. He had been invited, years earlier, to consult on a private research initiative connected to a national space program, an invitation he had declined, without offering any public explanation at all to the reporters who briefly asked about it at the time. He had co-founded a battery technology company that once showed extraordinary promise, only to sell his shares for a fraction of their eventual value. After a personal tragedy forced him to step entirely away from public life and rebuild something quieter, he had spent every year since carefully rebuilding his world, refusing every opportunity to reclaim the recognition he had once been freely offered by people who wanted his name attached to their projects. Victoria read through it all alone in her office long after midnight, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something far closer to shame than to curiosity about a man she had dismissed in under 2 seconds. In the weeks after the unveiling, footage of the Hypercar's dramatic recovery spread far beyond the automotive press, drawing attention from business journals and technology programs, eager to understand exactly what had happened on that stage. Analysts debated the mysterious repair for days, some insisting it must have been a scripted moment designed to generate exactly this kind of attention, others pointing out that no marketing department would ever risk a stunt capable of collapsing a stock price in real time. Victoria refused every interview request about the incident, uncertain herself how to explain a man she had publicly humiliated only hours before he saved her company's reputation in front of the entire industry. She found herself replaying the moment often, the quiet certainty in his voice when he said, "Try now," so unlike the frantic energy of every engineer who had failed before him, and she began to suspect that her research into his background would only deepen a discomfort she was not yet ready to fully confront. The relief that followed that first crisis lasted only a few days before a second, far more dangerous problem revealed itself without warning in the middle of the night. An unknown intruder breached the company's internal servers overnight, locking away months of critical testing data behind an encryption wall that none of Sterling Hyperdynamics' own security specialists could manage to break through no matter how many hours they threw at the problem. Investors who had only just regained their fragile confidence in the company began quietly questioning whether an insider had been responsible for the breach, whispers of sabotage spreading through private boardrooms faster than any official statement could ever hope to contain or correct. The financial exposure ran into the billions if the stolen data could not somehow be recovered in time before competitors found a way to exploit it for their own advantage. Victoria, who had barely weathered the public humiliation of one crisis only days earlier, felt her carefully maintained composure finally begin to crack under the mounting weight of what might follow next if the situation continued to spiral out of control. Ethan, when asked to help a second time, approached the new crisis with the same unhurried calm he had shown standing on that stage days earlier under far brighter lights. He suspected almost immediately that the attack itself was not truly the work of some anonymous outsider working alone, but something far closer to home, a calculated diversion designed to draw everyone's attention away from a much older theft happening quietly underneath it the entire time. Working through server logs long after the rest of the exhausted security team had finally gone home for the night to rest, he traced the intrusion back through layer after layer of deliberately obscured access points, following a trail that had clearly been designed to discourage anyone from following it too closely. Eventually, he found exactly what he had suspected from the very beginning of his investigation. A former technical director who had left the company years earlier under quiet, unremarkable circumstances, and who had since been secretly selling proprietary research to a direct rival firm for a considerable sum of money. The attack, it turned out, had never truly been about ransom at all, despite what the initial panic suggested to everyone involved. It had been cover, a smokescreen carefully designed to hide a far older and more calculated betrayal already well underway, long before anyone noticed the servers had been compromised. Federal investigators were briefly consulted once the scale of the breach became clear, though their involvement moved slowly through layers of jurisdiction and procedure that offered little comfort to a company hemorrhaging confidence by the hour. Employees throughout the building grew anxious as rumors circulated about layoffs, about lawsuits from investors, about the possibility that Sterling Hyperdynamics might not survive a second scandal so soon after the first. Victoria called an emergency meeting of her senior staff late one night. Her voice measured but visibly strained as she asked them, one by one, whether they believed the company could recover from another public failure so soon. Several of them hesitated before answering, and their hesitation told her more than any words could have. It was in the middle of that same tense week, with morale collapsing throughout the building, that Ethan quietly asked for server access and a quiet corner to work in, needing no assurances, no meetings, and no explanations beyond the raw data itself. Over the following days, Ethan worked closely alongside the company's engineering team to recover the locked data piece by piece, patch the vulnerabilities that had allowed the original breach to occur, neutralize the malicious code buried deep within the system, and trace every single step of the leak back to its true source, with methodical, unhurried precision that impressed even the most skeptical members of the security staff. Victoria watched him carefully during those long hours spent inside the cramped server room, half expecting arrogance from a man who had twice succeeded where her own celebrated experts had failed, and finding instead something entirely unexpected in how he carried himself around others. He listened far more than he spoke during those long working sessions. When a junior engineer named Marcus made a costly mistake under mounting pressure one evening, without a trace of blame in his voice, treating the error as a quiet opportunity to teach rather than a chance to embarrass someone in front of colleagues who were already frightened enough. He never once mentioned his own credentials during any of it, never referenced the patents, the invitations, or the company he had once built entirely from nothing years before. Watching him move through the chaos with such steady, quiet authority, Victoria began to understand something she had never fully grasped before in her years of leadership, that real strength rarely needed to raise its voice in order to be heard clearly by the people around it who mattered most. It was during those same long nights spent working side by side that Victoria finally learned the fuller truth of what Ethan had once built, and later chosen to give away entirely without asking for anything in return. Years earlier, long before Sterling Hyperdynamics had ever existed as a company, Ethan had developed a thermal management framework for battery systems that eventually became a foundational technology across the entire electric vehicle industry worldwide, a system so widely adopted that most engineers using it today had absolutely no idea a single quiet person's design lay at its very origin decades earlier. He had never once sought recognition for the work, filing the patents quietly and licensing them without ever attaching his name publicly to the technology itself. When his own company faced sudden collapse following the devastating loss of his wife, he sold the rights to the technology in order to protect the colleagues who depended on the business for their livelihoods and their families, choosing their stability over his own legacy without a single visible moment of hesitation or regret. Victoria asked him directly, one quiet evening in an otherwise empty office long after everyone else had gone home, why he had never told anyone the truth, why he had simply allowed the world to credit others for something that had genuinely started with him in his own hands. Ethan considered the question carefully for a long moment, before finally answering her honestly. "Machines don't care who gets the credit," he said quietly, looking down at his hands rather than at her. "They only care whether you actually understand them well enough to fix them when they break." She asked him once, during those same conversations, whether he ever regretted walking away from the recognition he had earned, whether some quiet part of him wished the world knew what he had built before it became common knowledge inside every engineering department in the country. Ethan considered the question honestly, rather than brushing it aside the way he brushed aside most compliments. He told her that recognition had once mattered to him, back when he was younger and hungrier and certain that acknowledgement was the same thing as meaning, but that losing his wife had taught him a harder lesson about what actually deserved his attention in the time he had left. He said that watching a system come back online, watching something broken become whole again through careful, patient work, gave him a satisfaction no headline had ever managed to provide. Victoria listened to every word without interrupting, and for the first time since founding her company, she wondered whether she had built her entire career chasing the wrong kind of reward. Victoria could not shake the quiet weight of that single answer. And within days, she made a decision that surprised nearly everyone who worked closely beneath her at the company. She called a press conference, not to celebrate another achievement the way she usually did, but to correct, publicly and without excuse, a mistake she had made in full view of the entire industry weeks earlier. Standing before the same reporters, who had once broadcast her company's failure to the whole world with obvious relish, she admitted, without a single qualification or defense, that she had judged a man by the clothes on his back and the grease beneath his fingernails, and that the judgment had proven not only deeply unfair to him personally, but nearly catastrophic for everyone who depended on her leadership every single day at the company. She offered Ethan the position of Chief Innovation Officer right there on the spot, in front of the cameras, a role carrying real authority, visibility, and a salary that would have transformed most people's lives overnight, without a second thought. Ethan declined the offer gently but firmly when she asked him privately afterward, explaining simply that titles had never interested him, and likely never would no matter how generous the offer became. Victoria did not give up quite so easily on the idea of keeping him close to the company. She offered instead a role as special advisor, flexible, informal, structured entirely around his own terms rather than hers or the board's expectations. And this time, after a long and thoughtful pause, Ethan finally agreed to stay. The press conference itself drew far more attention than Victoria had anticipated. Clips of her apology circulating through business news programs for days afterward, commentators praising a level of public accountability rarely seen from executives at her level of visibility. Some analysts speculated that the gesture was calculated, a clever piece of reputation management designed to win back investor trust after 2 consecutive crises, but those who watched the recording closely noticed something harder to fake, a genuine crack in her composure, as she described the moment she realized how completely she had misjudged the man standing quietly at the edge of the room. Employees throughout Sterling Hyperdynamics spoke about the moment for months afterward, many admitting privately that it changed how they thought about their own colleagues in maintenance and support roles, people whose expertise rarely appeared on any organizational chart. Richard Alden, watching from the back of the room that day, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, having waited years for someone at the top of that company to finally understand what he had always believed about talent hiding in unglamorous places. Their working partnership began cautiously at first, built on a foundation of mutual respect, rather than easy familiarity between 2 people who barely knew one another beyond a single stressful week. 2 people who had started from entirely opposite assumptions about one another were now slowly learning just how wrong those early assumptions had truly been in almost every respect. Victoria found herself seeking his opinion not only on technical matters within the company, but on decisions reaching far outside his stated expertise, valuing deeply the way he seemed to consider every possible angle carefully, before ever speaking aloud in a meeting. Ethan found in her something he had not expected to find either. A genuine willingness to admit fault publicly and often. A real hunger to understand the people she led, rather than simply manage them from a comfortable distance the way she once had. Over the following months, their professional relationship deepened gradually into something neither of them had planned for at all when they first met under such difficult circumstances. A quiet closeness built through long conversations after board meetings ended, shared meals that began as strategy sessions and slowly ended as something gentler and warmer than either expected, and a mutual respect that carefully, patiently, became genuine affection that neither one of them rushed to name aloud too quickly. Their days together settled into an easy rhythm neither had expected to enjoy so completely after such a rocky beginning. Mornings were often spent reviewing prototype data over coffee that grew cold, while they talked about things far beyond the numbers on the screen in front of them. Afternoons found them walking the testing track together, discussing ideas that had nothing at all to do with engines or quarterly projections. Evenings sometimes stretched late, when Victoria found herself lingering in the workshop long after her staff had gone home, simply because she preferred Ethan's quiet company to the silence, waiting for her back at her own apartment. She learned that he still kept a small photograph of his late wife on his workbench, tucked beside his tools rather than hidden away in a drawer somewhere, a quiet reminder rather than a wound he tried to avoid looking at each day. She learned that he cooked simple meals from memory rather than recipes, that he read old engineering journals for pleasure rather than obligation, and that he laughed rarely but completely when something genuinely amused him rather than simply being polite. Ethan, in turn, watched Victoria soften in small, unannounced ways over those months. Noticed how she began asking her employees about their families before asking about deadlines, how she started arriving early not to inspect anyone, but simply to listen to what people had to say before the day's pressures began. Neither of them spoke of romance directly for a long while, content instead to let respect deepen naturally into something neither wanted to rush or name too soon before it was ready. Their courtship, if it could even be called that in the early months, unfolded in small and unremarkable moments rather than grand gestures neither of them had any real appetite for. There was an evening when Victoria stayed late simply to hand him a cup of coffee she had made without being asked, and another when Ethan repaired the ignition switch on her personal car without mentioning it until she noticed the receipt was missing from the shop. There was a quiet dinner after a difficult board meeting where neither of them discussed the company at all, talking instead about the small coastal town where Ethan had grown up, and the mountain town where Victoria had spent childhood summers with grandparents. She rarely mentioned to anyone else. Slowly, without either of them announcing it to their colleagues, they began arriving at industry events together, sitting closer than professional distance strictly required, and finding excuses to extend conversations that could easily have ended after 5 minutes. Neither rushed toward a label for what was growing between them, content instead to let it develop with the same patience Ethan brought to every engine he had ever repaired. 1 year after that disastrous unveiling, Project Phoenix had quietly become the most commercially successful hypercar anywhere in the world, its underlying technology licensed across multiple industries, and its very name now synonymous with a genuine turning point in electric vehicle engineering history. Sterling Hyperdynamics no longer merely competed near the top of its industry the way it once had. It defined the industry entirely, setting benchmarks that rival companies spent years scrambling to match without success. Victoria's leadership style had transformed just as thoroughly as her company's fortunes had over that same remarkable year of recovery and growth. She spoke often to new employees during their first week about the night she nearly lost everything, simply because she judged a man by his uniform instead of by his mind and his years of quiet, unrecognized work. She repeated the lesson so frequently that it slowly became something close to company doctrine among the staff. Never judge someone by their uniform, she would tell them plainly during orientation, because the very person you dismissed today might be the only one capable of saving you tomorrow when everything else has failed. Employees who had joined the company after the crisis often struggled to believe the stories told about that first chaotic week. Stories that had by now taken on the quality of legend within the building, retold at orientation sessions, and repeated over lunch tables by veterans who had witnessed the events firsthand. New engineers were shown, as part of their training, a short recording of Ethan's 10 quiet minutes beneath the vehicle, not to teach them the technical specifics of the repair, but to remind them that the person least likely to be consulted might hold the answer no one else could find. Victoria insisted the recording remain part of the training precisely because it embarrassed her personally, a permanent record of her own worst assumption, one she preferred to keep visible, rather than quietly erase from the archives. Ethan, when asked about the recording, only shrugged and said the story mattered less than the habit it was meant to build in people, the simple habit of actually looking at a problem before deciding who was qualified to solve it. At the company's anniversary celebration, held inside a glass-walled hall, overlooking the entire city skyline at dusk, Victoria stood before her employees, her investors, and the very same reporters who had once documented her public failure in vivid, unflattering detail, and thanked Ethan by name in front of every single one of them gathered there that evening. Her voice remained steady, but noticeably warmer than anyone in that industry had ever heard it before in any previous appearance. The room applauded warmly at the mention of his name, and for once Ethan did not slip quietly toward the exit the way he usually preferred, choosing instead to remain beside her as the room celebrated something they had built together rather than something achieved alone through her efforts. Later that same evening, the two of them found themselves standing alone on the rooftop terrace above the celebration. The city spread out beneath them, in a soft wash of golden evening light, the noise of the party below fading gradually into something distant and entirely unimportant compared to the quiet between them. Victoria admitted quietly, almost to herself as much as to him, that the most valuable thing she had gained that entire year was not the $80 million machine that had once humiliated her on a public stage, nor the billion-dollar contracts that eventually followed its remarkable success across the industry, but the simple lesson in humility that a quiet mechanic had taught her merely by being exactly who he was from the very first night they met. Ethan smiled at that, the same small, unreadable smile he had first offered her on the night they met beside a car that refused to start, and told her he would be glad to help build whatever came next, together this time, rather than watching quietly from a distance the way he once preferred to live his life. Victoria reached for his hand then, without hesitation, and he did not pull away from her touch. Below them, the city lights shimmered against the dark water in the distance, and somewhere far beneath the terrace, the low hum of Project Phoenix idled quietly in its private garage. A machine that had once nearly ended everything she had built, now standing as quiet proof of everything that had been rebuilt, instead over the course of a single difficult year. The story closed not with grand declarations or dramatic promises exchanged beneath fireworks, but with something simpler and far steadier than either of them had expected to find, the two of them driving Project Phoenix together, along a quiet coastal road, as dawn slowly broke over the water. The engine hummed low and confident beneath them, carrying two people who had each learned, in their own separate and difficult ways, that the truest measure of a person's worth was never found in appearances, but in the quiet, unglamorous competence of those willing to do the work without ever asking for applause in return.